The Thriller in River City. No. What about the Melee in Slurpee Town? The Donnybrook in Wholesale City.
Hey, Dan, what you working on there?
Oh, man, I'm trying to come up with some new catchphrases and taglines for a series of new radio ads to promote the podcast. I think we could be a bit more creative about how we advertise Nigan and the Lone Ranger, and thought, why not go crazy? Why not adopt some of the hyperactive hyperbole of the wonderful world of professional wrestling?
Well, I admit that I do like that. I teach classes on that, and frankly, I think that's a fantastic idea. What you got so far?
Well, here's the problem. I'm not really a fan of wrestling like you. So I'm really having trouble finding the right, what's the word, tone.
Okay. Not to worry, my trusty trail mate. I got this. And now, for our featured podcast bout, on the blue mic, weighing in at an undisclosed weight, you know him as the frequent tormentor of provincial governments, a man who has never met an issue he could not opine on. It's the high priest of hyperbole, the Riverview Wrangler, a legend in his own tortured mind, Dan the Lone Ranger Lett. And on the red mic, he's an academic. He's a media personality, and he's a man who's never turned down a speaking engagement. Known throughout the podcast world as the master of bombast, the Anishinaabe assassin, and spirit guide to Canadians who just want to understand treaty, it's Nigan the Destroyer Sinclair. Let's get ready to podcast.
Nigan.
Yeah.
Do I have to wear tights now?
Absolutely. And before we show up at the studio, we have to smear ourselves in baby oil.
The Winnipeg Free Press proudly presents, in partnership with CJNU 93.7 FM, Nigan and the Lone Ranger. Here are your hosts, Nigan Sinclair and Dan the Lone Ranger Lett.
Welcome, everybody. It is another episode of Nigan and the Lone Ranger.
And I'm back.
And he's back, yes, from an undisclosed location.
Dan.
Yeah, that's just, we just made an agreement that I write columns and newsletters about my vacations, and Nigan just disappears.
I like to get some time away from internet and places to go, and so I go throughout Manitoba. I also go a bit to the States and do some other things. But anyways, more importantly, I'm back. Here I am.
And you're entitled to your privacy, and I'm entitled to give you a hard time about it. But the other thing I wanted to mention, for those of you who just enjoyed our opening funny bit, that there's always a nugget of truth, a thread of truth that runs through, like Wonder Woman's lasso of truth that runs through everything we do, and that is that you are a bona fide wrestling nutty fan.
Well, maybe less emphasis on the nutty, but just for the record, I actually do teach classes at the University of Manitoba on professional wrestling, because when you study Indigenous communities and young Indigenous men particularly, and we like to sort of classify Indigenous men in a particular type of way in our society, and oftentimes we ask questions like, why is it that we have these challenges, these issues, and so on? But the biggest culture amongst First Nations in Manitoba is professional wrestling. There's really nothing that's more influential. And so I teach classes on what does that mean, what's the impact of that on young Indigenous men particularly. And also, if you watch the 1980s, the most fascinating appropriations of culture happen with people posing to be Indigenous, or sometimes Indigenous peoples who become heroes of cities like Minnesota in the 1970s. So in the 1970s, generally, most non-Indigenous peoples hate Indigenous peoples, except for when you go to the wrestling matches, when they would all cheer for Chief Wahoo McDaniel. So it's this kind of weird anomaly. And I think these are important moments so yes, there's a grain of truth. Yes, it's kind of funny that I like professional wrestling, but I like teaching it. Okay,
so in converting it to an academic discipline, you're just trying to suck the fun out of it. Is that, it's Like because I mean, like I'm not. I refuse to be one of those guys who say, "Oh, I never watch wrestling." I mean, I rarely watch wrestling, but I did one of the first stories I did for the Winnipeg Free Press back in was because I don't like to tell people when I started, but it was in the '80s, in the late '80s. Hulk Hogan came to Winnipeg. It was the first time he had been to Winnipeg in a really long time. It was just on the upslope of the World Wrestling Federation before it became World Wrestling Entertainment. So it was just as, wrestling was going from a previously successful niche form of entertainment to like one of the biggest, entertainment companies in the world. So the Hulkster came and I got to go in early, to the old Winnipeg Arena and talk to all the guys behind the scene. And they, and it is true. Like, especially when you're at ringside, these guys are, and the women, they're tremendous athletes. Like, the stuff that they do is crazy. And so I didn't get to interview the Hulkster. They thought they were gonna let me interview him ahead of time, but in the end he wouldn't do it. But he did come out for the feature bout, and I can't remember who he was wrestling. It was
and I bet
some lamentably, somebody representing some easily vilified visible minority, I'm sure.
And I bet if you look in the audience, like it was when I was growing up, is the one time that my dad took me to the arena other than a Jets game was to go to wrestling and go to the wrestling matches. Also, my mother took me and my family took me, my uncle took me. And I will say one other thing before we get into our topics for today, but I was at the recent AEW, All Elite Wrestling show at the Bell Center downtown. And at the end of the night, no surprise, most of the place is Indigenous. At the end of the night, the three superstars of the show, which is Chris Jericho, Kenny Omega, and Don Callis, who are all Winnipeg guys, all came out with the Jets jersey on, basically to pander to the home crowd. But it was the Indigenous Jets jersey that they wore, the Wasak jersey. And I think that's indicative. That shows you that there's a really interesting relationship between the Indigenous community and professional wrestling that's worth thinking about. And yes, I make it a bit dull by talking about it that way, but I think it's interesting. And that's probably partly why I like it, but I also have a secret, affinity towards just watching and bad guys, good guys, comic books kind of on screen kind of thing.
I will say that the most interesting thing that happened to me at that Hulk Hogan bout was that photographer working with me was Ken Gelati, longtime Free Press photographer, great guy. And Kenny was like right by the corner, like right by the turnbuckles, was trying to get like a great picture of the Hulkster doing like the big scissor kick, like what is that when they do the big kick up in the air and scissor, and he used to come down with his one leg across the other.
It's like the leg drop.
Drop, okay. And he went to go kick up, and his other foot came and smacked the end of Ken's lens and drove the camera back into his face, and he had like a big black eye and stuff like this. But what was interesting was, and this is like 14,000 screaming fans, the penultimate moment, and he kicks Ken's camera, and he actually stopped, like for a heartbeat, went over and put his his hand on Ken, said, "You okay?"
Well, I think he was probably more worried about a lawsuit.
And Kenny said, yeah, like that. And then he went back into character. It was great.
Oh, that's nice of him.
Yeah.
This week, it's springtime. And I was away.
And that means in Manitoba.
In Manitoba, it means sandbag time is actually what it usually means.
Yeah.
It's flood time. And for those of us here on Treaty 1 territory, we're inundated now with where to get sandbags, how to get sandbags, and we're very closely watching the situation in Fargo, North Dakota, as the mayor, Tim Mahoney, has ordered 200,000 sandbags to be built over the coming week to try to save that city from what it will be a fairly brutal, not in the most brutal, but fairly brutal spring thaw. What happens in this area is a couple things. One is we've deforested almost the entirety of the Red River, which the Mississippi River system flows into the Red River system. And because the Lake Winnipeg watershed is like a big funnel, it all flows into Lake Winnipeg. And so you've got this deforested system. And if any of you ever, have a Christmas tree, you know what I mean by that. Think about how much water that Christmas tree drinks. And that shows you a lot about how when we deforest and we create farms, then that's flooding. And then, of course, never mind the fact that we've got, exponential amount of rainfall and ecological situations according to climate change. So here we are now facing yet another flood, and inevitably that impacts First Nations because we have a floodway here in Winnipeg that drives all the water north.
Yep.
And situations like at Peguis, who has a new chief, by the way. Congratulations to Stan Bird, who's a brand new chief, unseated longtime chief Glenn Hudson in last week's election. But immediately enters office and boom, he's facing a flooding crisis situation like most First Nations up on Lake Winnipeg on the river systems up there. And so mostly we're all just sending our wishes and love to everybody who is along the Red River. The situation's hopefully going to be not as bad as it was in previous years, and certainly for Peguis not as bad as it was last year, said to be the flood of the century. But, flooding is a real issue for all of us, and especially in your community where you live.
Yeah, unfortunately, within that far, I'm right in the middle of the city, Riverview, and the river does get high, but there's enough parkland. Now, that's except when you go to the St. Vital Bridge, and then below there, that's all property, built right up against the riverbank. They've done a ton of work. Reinforcing and building berms and stuff like that. I think that over the years, as a news event, covering flooding is it's sort of my and apologies to people who are suffer from floods, but in terms of the fascination, the flood stories that I've covered are the most fascinating. I was in Fargo for 3 weeks in 2009. When they almost lost the city, like they did years earlier in Grand Forks. And literally was out walking across these gigantic sandbag dikes and they were using all these devices to shore them up, and watching, there was less than a foot of freeboard. So you're walking up to the top of the sandbags, and as soon as you get up there, the water was right there. So a stiff wind would have taken the whole thing down.
Yeah.
And, really, there's something about flooding that's directly connected to, the Red River Prairie, culture. I'm not saying that it always is expressed in positive terms, but there is something about people who are born and bred here and their relationship to the river. Indigenous 100%. And non-Indigenous.
Yeah, 100%.
It's crazy.
People write poems about it. I'd say probably it's one of the most powerful images in novels and poetry of the city, whether it be Carol Shields or Katerina Vermette, or talking about their relationship to the river is so crucial. And one place I have spent some time is New Orleans, and having seen the impacts of flooding and the break of the levees reminds me so much of how this sort of onset panic back in the famous we have so many famous flood times. But the famous 2011 flood, 1997 flood. The 1997 one is the one that really imprints itself in your memory because there was this mass panic in the city. And I remember out in Selkirk, where I was growing up at the time, and we had the Army right there. And the Army came in, moved into town. We're doing hourly patrols to watch the Red River. And then at the end of it all, we had a charity soccer game against the Army guys, and which the entire town came out. It was a very interesting time period. This is the interesting time period, unfortunately, but it's also very devastating for those in Manitoba.
Flooding is an interesting story as a political story. Because a series of bad floods can change the fiscal fortunes of a provincial government, and not a defense of everything they did wrong. But Greg Selinger got walloped by huge floods that were really out of traditional season. It wasn't so much the spring. He had summer flooding, which was really an unusual thing. But the most 97 was bad, but the most expensive flood ever in terms of the cost to government was 2011.
I think it was 2011.
Yeah, 2011 was over $1 billion in damages and flood fighting costs. It really it makes or breaks political careers. Interestingly enough, as well, at the same time as all that water is, creating havoc with overland flooding, it's also, and not because they enjoy the suffering that goes on, but, there are people over at Manitoba Hydro rubbing their hands together going, oh, yeah, baby, extra water in the reservoirs, extra water in the rivers, and it's one of those weird relationships that we have with nature here in Manitoba, that the years that they have overland flooding with all that extra precipitation are the years that, Manitoba Hydro does boffo. So,
as much as Hydro looks forward to it, I think, or, not so much look forward to it. Hydro realizes the impacts and how there is always a yang to the yin in these kinds of situations. But then also, there is a tremendous amount of law firms in Manitoba that have built entire careers, entire portfolios based on flooding of First Nations communities.
Yeah.
And I really witnessed that when I was involved with the Kias generating station and the Bipole 3 consultations, because most First Nations with their law firms were all talking about compensation from flooding and the fact that when you build these hydro projects that it inevitably involves a great deal of flooding impacts. And so, law firms as well are a big part of...
Yeah. So not only is it flooding season, but it is pre-election polling season as well.
Which is a different kind of flood, but
different kind of There's a different kind of, what is the word, effluent that's involved in but it is. We're fast approaching the end of the spring session of the Manitoba Legislature. I think if Premier Heather Stephenson was going to call an election early, she would have done it right after the budget. I think I've said this before, I do not make hard and firm predictions, but I will say this, that she will wait till October. She'll drop the writ in September for an election that will culminate October the 3rd. And but that means too that there's a lot of attention on the polling that we do with Probe Research. And, quick capsulized version of the polling, NDP good, Conservatives really not so good, and especially in Winnipeg, and Liberals threatening to drop off the face of the earth, which is really kind of unusual.
And the Conservatives haven't even picked candidates for a whole bunch of seats. That's interesting, mostly for the fact that they've had a massive amount of people who, long-standing members of the party that have left the party or that aren't running again.
Yep.
And maybe they haven't left the party, but they're certainly not running for election. And then the NDP, of course, kind of have this control of Winnipeg. And the Liberals, where were they? But they were there during a sort of weird anomaly moment in Manitoba electoral politics where you see a debate. Well, how many months out, right? 6 months out of an election, you saw a pre-election debate. It was hosted by the Association of Manitoba Municipalities. So I actually got to see the three leaders on stage debating issues. When does that happen?
Well, no, it's very unusual. The one thing for sure, though, is that, and I think that if I was a progressive conservative, I would be perturbed that the AMM decided to host a election-style debate between the three leaders, because the Association of Manitoba Municipalities is a progressive conservative forum. And that's not to say that when the NDP are in power, they ignore them. But the AMM and the local government leaders that are opinion leaders within that group, they're just, the affinity is with the progressive conservatives. So, usually when the PC with a PC government, you would get a cavalcade of PC ministers rolling through, doing speeches. The premier would do a keynote. This time she had to share the stage. I found that significant. There were, our coverage of that, though, we got a chance to throw questions at all three leaders, and all three leaders attempted to say that our polling results were, they don't think about our polling results. They just, the quote is, oft-heard quote is, the only poll that matters is the one on election day, which is true.
I actually think Wab Canoe said that, I think. In some version of that.
It is true, and it's also bullcrap. Are you going to, just as an aside, are you going to beat me? I only found out last week that he beeps me when I say, I'm going to say the word that I said because I know he's going to beep me. When I say
I was so shocked that
he said,
that
but
you
then
got beeped.
he said, well, I just think it's really funny when I beep you.
I'll be honest.
No, I want to say that what an amazing job you're doing producing overall, but beeping Dan is the absolute winner of you're got a permanent job in my eyes.
I thought that I would start with, swears, and then as time goes on, sneak it into just other things that we don't want people to hear Dan saying.
I just on top of that, speaking of replacing political parties are now replacing their name. The Saskatchewan Liberals have voted to change their party name. So have, I believe, the Alberta Liberals.
They don't want to be Liberals
They don't
anymore.
want to be Liberals anymore. And in the context of what you just described, in that the Liberal Party in Manitoba seems to be, has been on life support maybe for a while. But I would say that one thing that the Liberals in Manitoba is they've always been a very scrappy party. They've been working very hard, sticking around. I mean, there's 100 reasons why the Liberals should have faded out a long time ago. But John Gerard and Dougald Lamont now just fighting a good fight. But it's interesting that on the prairies that most of the Liberal parties are changing their names, getting rid of the term Liberal.
Liberal is the Voldemort
In the West, for sure.
Yeah, actually, I think I use that. I think I use that a lot. The Voldemort of X. The name that shall not be mentioned.
So just to be with the times, I'm thinking we're talking about beeping. I mean, maybe we should beep out the word liberal to be more favorable to our Western counterparts here.
No,
You're gonna. Hey, have you got your finger on the beeping button? F***ing liberals? No, exactly.
Dan, you're going to get us an R rating on our show.
The interesting thing,
I'm
though,
hoping,
is going to be which of those two words gets beeped.
There'd be a double beep.
Well, I look forward to the day that we have a Manitoba Liberal on our show.
Yeah.
And we will ask that question. Why are Liberal parties across the West getting rid of their name, changing their name? And, what does that look like? And it relates a lot to, I think this is a pivotal election for the Liberals as much as it is for the Conservatives and for the NDP.
Yeah.
What will the Liberals do after this? They've had Dougald Lamont as a leader for quite a while now. And what kind of impact does that have? What does it look like in Manitoba with or without a Liberal Party? And going forward in the future, I mean, maybe pollings matter, maybe they don't. I mean, certainly with the U.S. elections, they seem to not matter.
Yeah.
And we in the media care a lot about it. I'm not sure everybody else cares about them as much.
Yeah. I mean, to tell you the truth, polls are still relatively accurate, way more than they're inaccurate. And I think in those instances where the polls have been considered inaccurate, what you're really talking about is a much more fluid electorate, like where there are huge changes in, voter sentiment very close to the election. People deciding to vote at the last moment, that kind of thing. But anyways
is right.
So we're very fortunate today. Our feature interview is going to be with somebody I've known for a really long time in a number of different contexts.
And someone with lots of respect throughout the province, long-standing progressive conservative member, cabinet member, Minister of Status of Women, Rochelle Squires, is going to join us.
Minister of Families, yes.
And Minister of Families as well. I think has multiple portfolios. Maybe we'll find
out. Yeah. So she's been good enough to come in and talk to us about a recent announcement she made and about her political future and the political future of her government and party. And yes, so let's now go and talk to Rochelle Squires. So I'm kind of fortunate enough that I've been doing this long enough that I've known some people in politics for a very, very long time. And this person I've known not only in politics but also in journalism, both as a fellow journalist for a period of time and then a communications press secretary type for a period of time before she truly went to the dark side and became an elected official. But it also means that when you get to know somebody before they're a politician, you do sort of understand where they're coming from and quite frankly, that they're sincere about what they're doing, because Rochelle Squires certainly saw enough of politics from other perspectives that if she wasn't sincere about doing it, she probably would have learned enough to stay the heck away. So, but anyways, Rochelle, thank you so much for doing the podcast with us today.
Well, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here and really greatly admire the work of that both of you do. And so pleased to be a part of today's show.
Well, I admire your work. Dan, not so much.
No.
But I'm not so sure about Dan. But,
No.
but, you know, I have a question for you, just right to start off, because, you know, when I was doing some research for the interview today, I was just sort of blown away by how many titles you have. You know, not only do you represent the constituency, of Riel, which I'm sure is a whole job unto itself, but then you also you're the minister responsible for accessibility, minister responsible for Francophone affairs, and minister responsible for the status of women, and also minister of families. So which is your favorite title?
Oh, God.
And it's like picking your children, right?
That's right.
Which is the one that
That's
you
an
like the
unfair question, because it's like asking a mother, which of your children do you like the best? I enjoy all aspects of my work. And I was really fortunate to get elected at a time when not only was I, now a newly elected MLA, I was also asked to serve in cabinet. And while I certainly didn't feel like I had the qualifications back then, having been on the job for all of 6 days, the answer that I had offered was a resounding yes. And so I've been very fortunate to be in cabinet now for 7 years, and really, truly do enjoy representing my community and all that entails. And then my portfolio right now is something that is just really near and dear to my heart. When we talk about disabilities, every family is touched in some way, shape, or form by disabilities. And then families, of course, for me, it's very full circle. My family history and my background certainly did touch upon some of the systems and processes that are in my portfolio now. And that's been a real honor of a lifetime to be part of that full circle. And status of women, I would say arguably the reason I got into politics was to really make a difference for women and girls. And so the work that I get to do in that portfolio is just a huge honor. So I can't pick. Sorry to give you a politician's answer.
I groaned into the microphone and they're like, oh no, we're going to hear about, it's like someone talking about how proud they are of all their different parts to the family. But I mean, I totally respect that. I think that, probably the biggest impact or one of the biggest portfolios, because we've had on the show before Kevin Chief, and Kevin Chief, of course, had been the Minister of Families and things along that line. I mean, that's such a big portfolio unto itself, and especially in Manitoba with the history of child welfare and the issue around supporting families. And then, of course, that goes into so many other issues like the middle class, economy, finance, and then just public safety. The Minister of Families portfolio has got to be one of the hardest portfolios in the whole government, and I think it's often unsung as well.
I would agree that it's definitely a challenging portfolio, and it's challenging, and yet it's also really rewarding. And I'm very fortunate to be coming into the portfolio at this time in history where not only are we halting many systems that were perhaps rooted in colonization and that perpetuated generational breakdowns. I'm in the portfolio at a time where we're able to stop some of that and walk back from some processes that were put in place years ago, and now move forward with change that we hope will make a meaningful difference, keeping families together and really helping children achieve better destinies than perhaps they were served in the past.
I mean, we could talk about the issue of child welfare all day, but I mean, Manitoba's really been at the forefront of so much change involving Bill C-92 and the control of First Nations of their child welfare systems and all the other ins and outs, and also some of the hiccups that happen along the way, or the challenges involving funding and so on. What do you think is the lasting impact, and I think we'll get into other things, but the lasting impact of the past few years on child welfare for not just First Nations, but First Nations are, of course, the most impacted. 90% of the child welfare system is First Nations. One
of the first things that I read after being appointed the Minister of Families was a 2018 Globe and Mail article that was quoting the Honourable Murray Sinclair. And in that article,
I might know that guy.
You might know.
He says
yeah.
something, except for when he grounds you. Then when he grounds you, then there's no reconciliation. I'll tell you that.
Exactly. His words at that time, when he had concluded his work with the TRC, was that the monster that was created in the residential school system has taken up a new home. And that home is the child welfare system, the foster system. And then he went on to say in this Globe and Mail article that if the child welfare system that existed today was in place when he was a boy, he would have been apprehended. And it takes no imagination at all to just think about the trajectory of his life and all the lives that he's impacted had he been apprehended as a young boy and not been given the opportunity to live with family and to stay in his community. And so I read that and I reflected on that and I thought, that is so true. We live in a province with historically high rates of child apprehension. We have a system that needs to be transformed from the bottom up. And so at the same time as he was concluding his work with the TRC, we saw the federal government bring in Bill C-92 and how that impacts the child welfare system. And in Manitoba, we're very, very proud that we were able to work with the first Indigenous community, the first Indigenous governing body to draw down jurisdiction and assume repatriation of their children both on reserve and off reserve, and that is at Peguis. And so really pleased to have been a part of that and to sign that historical agreement to see Peguis First Nation lead the way, not just in Manitoba, but in all of Canada for how to do child welfare better.
I did the training sessions on training the community because the community was quite suspicious of C-92.
Right.
And so I did all the community training and also the training of child welfare workers to understand that this is a good bill. This is a good opportunity. I think there's been some bumps along the way in terms of figuring jurisdiction and funding and so on. So lots to work out yet, but I think that's real. I think you're right. I mean, Manitoba has been at the forefront of so many issues, but particularly the implementation of C-92, one of the first to be able to do that.
Yeah, so and I'm just going to add, like, as you guys were talking about the family's portfolio, and sort of within the constellation of cabinet opportunities, families is certainly considered to be the most challenging, and I'll even say it, like, I think a lot of people think it's a graveyard, like for a politician, because as much as you do, like, I think you really do an amazing job of highlighting all the positive steps. It's just like it really is just one brush fire to another brush fire. So I'll set the stage here for one of the latest brush fires that the government set Rochelle in to fight. So we spent a better part of a little more than 2 weeks concerned about the fact that the forensic nursing program at Health Sciences, at the bottom, it dropped right out of it. The nurses who were working there, for many of their own reasons, but they resigned. And so the program was essentially could not provide medical support and forensic support for collecting evidence to women who were the victims of sexual assault. And, I mean, it's like, apart from the politics of it, it's just a horrible story because you're taking among the most vulnerable category of vulnerable communities and, admitting that you don't have help. So what happens is, like, after 2 weeks of pretty heavy-duty heat on the government, Rochelle comes in with an announcement, and I won't steal the details from you because I want you to go into it. But it was really like it was a bit of a salve to the burn that came with the original story. And so I'm interested. I want to hear the details of the $1.3 million for community-based support. But also maybe explain to me the origin of that. Was that something you were working on before the bottom dropped out of the Health Sciences Center program? Did you guys expedite the announcement? Because obviously, so tell me how it all came together.
So before I start to talk about the sexual assault crisis response, I would be remiss if I didn't say a hearty and grateful thank you to everybody who works in this space. I can't imagine how hard it is to be a nurse working in this space, seeing people at their most traumatized. And so everybody deserves our absolute gratitude. And then also to say how much I appreciate the courage of the survivors that have come forward to receive services through a sexual assault nurse examination program. 921 survivors went through the doors of the sexual assault nurse examination program at HSC last year. 921. So that number really, it just really gives me chills to think that we have that many survivors who need support. And I would say that we're not even capturing all the survivors. We know that there's a lot who don't go to a place for examination and to start on their healing. And so we had set up this program a little over a year ago, myself and Minister Gordon, where we wanted to formalize the program at HSC. And we committed the dollars to ensure that the nurses were not just casual, but full-time. And at that time, I don't think we'd even had the numbers quantified at that point, and we didn't anticipate the demand being 921 for that year. And all the time that we were setting up that program to be run in hospital, I'd been hearing from community and other survivors that have said being in a hospital is certainly not always a trauma-informed place. It certainly isn't always a person-centered approach either. And survivors have often expressed discomfort and barriers to going to hospital. And so I always did believe that there needed to be a corollary program that would be run in community, similar to third-party reporting. A few years ago, thanks to the good work of journalists, we saw how many sexual assault reports were discredited or not investigated upon by law enforcement. And we knew that there was this massive problem with people going forward to law enforcement to share their testimony and to start proceedings. And so the solution to that was third-party reporting, and we started that in Manitoba 4 years ago. And it's been rather successful in being a trauma-informed, person-centered approach, where if you've been sexually assaulted and you need to tell your story to somebody, you need to get on the path to journey and healing. Going to the police, not really an option for some. Going to hospital, again, not really an option for some. But clinic is the key here. So not only do they've been doing third-party reporting for us for 4 years now, and helping collect the testimony from those who aren't ready to go to law enforcement. And it's stored in a way that is viable if there's a case that's moves forward through report to law enforcement and such. The testimonies can hold up in court and all that. Now we have just partnered with them once again. Really extremely grateful for that partnership with Clinic and Gunnigunachuk that are going to do this program in community for us. And so we'll have a mobile unit available to go to the Gunnigunachuk site, and then also at Clinic. And it's definitely more trauma-informed. It is open for anybody who's experienced this violation, women, gender diverse individuals. And so we think that it is really a response to an urgent need that this community has asked for.
Well, I mean, I think particularly the mobile design or approach. I don't claim to be an expert at all in this kind of provision of social service or medical service, but there's something about that just smacked of like a triumph of common sense. Like it's because I think that there are noble intentions in the hospital-based program, but as you said, like hospitals are overlit sterile, bureaucratic institutions. Not a criticism of the great people who work in healthcare, but they are what they are. And where there's a lot of people with clipboards taking down information, and I think it might seem to be incongruous. So I saw that and I went, wow, that is like really smart. In your mind, do you and Minister Gordon have an idea of what may have happened on the other end of the program? Because I'm assuming, and you're going to correct me if I'm wrong, with some relish, I'm sure, if I'm wrong, is that the community-based programs, that's not enough to meet the need based on the explosion in demand for this kind of service. So what happened to the hospital program as far as you know, and what can we do so that that's part of the solution? Because obviously that needs to be part of it, right?
It certainly does need to be part of the solution. And I mean, the demand itself was really quite unexpected and overwhelming. And so I really do see this as being a two-part initiative where the hospital, they're 24/7 already. And so, and they also have other support staff, doctors and nurses who can deal with other traumas, because we know sometimes survivors are coming in and they've got multiple traumas that need to be dealt with. And there's definitely a fit for the hospital setting. And so getting that set up and stabilized, but definitely supporting corollary community-run program is the best of both worlds. And also with the mobile aspect, going and meeting people where they're at, because I can't think of anything more traumatic than showing up at the wrong place and saying, I just need help. I really need help. And being told, well, you got to get in a cab and go here, and we can't see you here. And so we're really just trying to figure out a solution so we can get round the clock coverage. Clinic in phase, in subsequent phases, will be looking to broaden their hours, and really just looking to meet people where they're at and provide that service. And the hospital program is definitely vital in this ecosystem.
Do you think that this hospital program and what you were trying to do with that, and with plans already afoot to augment with the community options, is this just collateral damage to the broader issue of healthcare staffing, or was there, have you guys come up with any indication that there was something about that program in particular that led to the nurses not want, because it was only the casual nurses. They didn't want to do their rotation through there. If we figured out what that is are we now wading into the big, because there just aren't enough nurses to go around right now.
Yeah, and I think if you look at what we've done with the Health Human Resources Initiative and really trying to ensure that we're recruiting and retaining as many healthcare professionals as possible, but it really is a conundrum. And I know that our Minister of Health and our Premier, they've been out frequently, and I know our Minister of Immigration was recently in the Philippines recruiting, trying to bring healthcare professionals. But you can go anywhere in this province and see massive recruitment efforts underway. I was just in Saskatchewan a few weeks ago. My Baba had passed away, and so my family and I went for the funeral, and we're driving through Yorkton, Saskatchewan, and there's this huge billboard that is talking about the incentives that the Saskatchewan government is offering for nurses. I think other jurisdictions, every jurisdiction is coming up with something. So it really does speak to the larger Health Human Resources Initiative. And I think where our government landed was all that to say, we just can't fail survivors, and let's just move forward in ways in which we can meet their immediate needs while we're working on some of the larger issues.
First of all, I think one of the greatest things that I heard about this $1.3 million announcement is that you're partnering with Gani Ganichik, because, cards on the table, I've worked lots with Gani Ganichik. My family has ceremonies in the building. Leslie Spillett is someone I deeply admire and respect. Saw her yesterday, in fact. So the partnering with that just seems such a smart move, because Gani Ganichik has networks that the government doesn't have, and frankly, when you are an individual who's been assaulted, sexual, physical, otherwise, as an Indigenous person with an Indigenous informed organization or Indigenous led organization, it's a game changer. And I think that we see that particularly with the number of neighborhood organizations, the Mama Bear Clan, the Bear Clan, so on. The success and the greatest success is that they're Indigenous run, often women run organizations, Indigenous female run organizations. And so as a result, they're bringing a competency that I'm sure you and, you know, I want to say a big miigwech to you for being a leader on this issue, because you yourself are a survivor of sexual assault. You've been very open about that, talking about that publicly. And undoubtedly, when you're in that trauma, that you need the most competency. You need the most somebody who's understanding of you, what you've gone through. And so that's a real... I think that's the best part of that announcement, in my opinion, anyways. And particularly in the context of Linda Beardy and the tremendous epidemic of violence against Indigenous women. But it seems to me at the same time there's like sort of this reversal in the past 2 years or 3 years of your government, in that there has been this turn towards community-run organizations, whereas perhaps, most notably, 2019, the Neighborhoods Alive program was cut, which really gutted the North End in mostly Indigenous organizations that really were put into emergency situations, and it was under your the previous premier that you were in that government as well. But it seems like the past 3 years, this government has turned back towards community-run organizations, neighborhood organizations, has doubled down almost. I'm thinking about Heather Stephenson's announcement about committing to poverty or committing money to poverty. You're talking now about 1.3 million with partnering with Gani Ganichik. Do you see that there's sort of this turn towards community-based organizations, partnering with them to deal with some of the major crises? But maybe it might be also the pandemic, because the pandemic has made everything really, really worse. And when you talked about that number of sexual assaults, I mean, that is inevitably impacted by the pandemic, because people were in those situations for such a long period of time. And we saw, I wrote a lot about this, that family violence really exponentially increased.
Yeah. You know, I think that government has really recognized that we can just go so much farther to serve the communities that we're elected to serve if we partner with community itself. And nowhere is that more evident than in my files. And I'm really excited about that, because the friendships and the connections that I've made in community has really led to the opening of more solutions. And I don't believe if my department hadn't had those relationships already with Clinic, with Gani Ganichik, I don't know if we would have been able to make this all come together in the way that it did, and other initiatives. And it started in the Status of Women Secretariat specifically a few years ago, when we realized that we needed to modernize our shelter system. The pandemic taught us so many lessons, and when we were white knuckling it through a pandemic, really hoping and just throwing stuff at the wall, making sure that we had the services in place for people who needed them the most. Because during the pandemic, think about it, we're telling people stay at home and safe at home, and we're all in this together. But really we weren't, because everybody had a different home to go to. And some people had a home that could be compared to as something that would be like a life raft. And other people were flailing about without that type of security. And so I think that was really, really brought to bear with people who were unsheltered and were seeking the services of whether it be Main Street Project or other shelters in the province, and then in our particularly in our domestic violence shelters, and knowing that we needed to have these supports there, because certain people would be they're being told stay at home, home's dangerous. Where do you go? What do you do? So fortunately, we made it through the pandemic and the worst of the pandemic, and our shelters were adequately able to provide the supports and make sure that they were there. And we wanted to recognize the work that that went into that. So we've increased the wages for people, anybody working in shelter. We needed to modernize those wages because we need to say thank you. And then we need to rebuild that sector to a certain extent because, as you can imagine, a lot of people left that sector. So we've got a micro-credential program through Red River, and the government, we will pay for people to take this micro-credential program so that you're qualified to work in shelter. And then we up the funding. We've almost doubled the funding for some of our shelters and our women's resource centers who are on the front lines of domestic violence on a regular basis. And then just from there, it snowballed. And working with good folks at Gunaganuchek, when they came to me and shared with me their plan for Velma's House, 24/7 safe space, low barrier for women who need it the most when they need it the most. And I was able to receive a presentation from Leslie and Dodie and realize that we really need this service available in Winnipeg. And so very pleased just a few weeks ago to partner with them on that initiative and give them $1.5 million in operating costs so that they can offer those services that will help women and gender diverse people receive not only the safety in the moment that they need it the most, but also services on an ongoing basis. Meeting a friendly person, developing that relationship.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't mean to push the issue really, but I mean, so many of those initiatives you described, I mean, amazing game changer initiatives that you're talking about. I mean, I work with the My Team program at Gunaganuchek, which is children coming out of the child welfare system. We give them safe places to go, positive ways to, many of them are 16, 17 years old. First time they're in apartments, they are trying to just get a good mentor, someone that can support them and see that they don't get caught up. And, you know, when you're 16, 17 in an apartment, you can imagine all the challenges that probably come up with it. But one of the challenges that Gunaganuchek and many other organizations in particularly the center of Winnipeg faced was when the Neighborhood Lives program was cut, then they were really in a dire situation. Then the pandemic was on top of that. And so if it wasn't for volunteers during the pandemic and the Bama Bear Clan 204, parts of eventually the 219 Inks, 219 Disraeli, you know, it really wouldn't have been as bad otherwise. So would you say that the government's learned a little bit from that situation, or is it that the pandemic really exponentially created a situation where urgently you had to partner?
I think it's both, twofold. I mean, I think we would have learned that lesson eventually and ultimately, because if you think about some of the services that that community offers and parallel services that the government offers would be underutilized. Why? Because there's not the trust, there's not the relationships, and nowhere is it more demonstrated than with the Canada-Manitoba housing benefit that is allocated for children or youth exiting care. It's a $250 a month. Well, we bumped it up to $350, but it was a $250 monthly housing benefit. No strings attached. If you are a kid, you've aged out of care, and you're renting here's $250 in shelter top-up. Underutilized. And then if we look at the tuition program that we have, the partnerships with many universities where children exiting the child welfare system don't have to pay tuition. Underutilized. Why is that? Because if I've opened up shop and said, here's some money, here's some programs, I'm not going to get the buy-in from the community as much as you will or other community organizations, just because the trust is there, the history is there, and the partnership is there. And so
it's also sometimes people don't want to go to school when they're feeling unsafe.
Sure.
or when they don't have connection with their family. I mean the trauma is real and the trauma is ongoing, and so that's also got to be part of a plan too. That the trauma, it's good to get off. Well, those are fantastic initiatives offering incentives to go to university, but you can't learn if you feel unsafe or if you feel traumatized, right? And
yeah, there's a larger piece that still needs to be addressed with helping kids age out of care effectively and set up in a way that they can achieve success, which might, it'll look different for every child aging out of care. I've got 5 kids. Their path to adulthood was very different for each and every circumstance, and that's the same with all the children that are aging out of care. but the options are there, and we need to find a way to bridge them into discovering the pathway to their potential and their destiny.
So potential and destiny. I mean, you're doing rebuilding, re-extending, as Nigan said, and the lifespan of any government. I mean, you make the best decisions you can, then you learn from those decisions and you move on. Right now, you could be looking at your last 6 months in a portfolio, and I'm not saying that that any of this is a inevitable byproduct of that, but I'm just wondering where, as much as you can. So the new programs, the new things you're doing now, the reacquainting yourselves with the value of community organizations, these things. I mean, there must be you must be struggling a bit with some people to rebuild trust from a government that took a very different approach over its first 3.5 years. And I think Manitobans have kind of responded to that. And I'd be the first to admit that I think there's a lot of people in the province who, that first 3.5 years, that was their experience with this government. And whatever they're doing now is maybe too easily dismissed. I think there's a certain amount of typecasting that's being done. In terms of the way Manitobans think about your government, how do you think we got to where we are now, where you guys are? And I know the most important, we were just talking about, this is the opening, the most important poll is on election day.
Yeah.
But the pre-election polls are not flattering. So how did we get here?
That's a huge question, Dan.
Yeah.
That's like, why is the sky blue?
Yeah. Did I tell you that in the podcast universe, like we don't, it doesn't cost us any money to go 3 hours. So just you be you now. Just get it. Yeah. So
we would need 3 hours to talk about how we got here, but we really are at a point where society has changed and is changing very rapidly. I would say society is changing quicker than ever in the last 20, 30 years. We're pivoting on issues. There's greater awareness on so many issues, and so I really think that that's part of the pivoting that as you've referred to it in regards to government response to community. So I think government is moving along and really doing what good government does, in that it reflects the wishes and the desires of community, and really listening to people and understanding what it is that they want. And as you know, we do have a new premier, and one of the things that she had said when she was campaigning for the job is that she wanted to hear from people, and she wanted to respond to what people had requested of her as if she were to be leader. And her key word was always collaborative, and she's really exemplified that. We have taken a listening approach. She's taken a listening approach, and I can say wholeheartedly and with sincere honesty that when I bring issues to her, the response is always, if you feel, and if I've made my case, if I've done my job as a cabinet minister to represent the facts, represent the need, and represent the solution, I can move forward with implementing it with relatively little input from her. And that's the way she has structured her cabinet. And I'm really fortunate to be in that cabinet where, we were talking about the emergency response initiative. I presented the program challenges and potential solution, and she was certainly on board with it. She said it is absolutely unacceptable that survivors are not getting the services that they need when they've got the courage to move forward and ask for help, and the response is not adequate. We need to address that. And she certainly endorsed any pathway that I brought forward that was reasonable and supported. She moved forward and said, go ahead.
So I promise I'm not trying to get you to speak ill of the politically deceased, but I did mention the issue of typecasting and the attitude that people have, the mindset that people have about this government. And I'll pick two of the issues that you mentioned. I mean, one is collaboration and listening, and the other one is perhaps this idea of responding to need, individual need, as is identified by ministers of the Crown. I mean, I don't. My words, not yours, but I don't really think that was part of the brand and reputation that this government earned over its first 3 years. I think that's about the fairest and most polite way that I can put it. The government developed a reputation for more unilateral action. It was trying to do some very ambitious things, and that required it to move quickly. But the previous premier was, I don't think collaboration, certainly outside of government, was maybe not seen as his strong suit. Do you think, you work closely with Minister Gordon, you're working closely with the Premier. Do you think that's part of the challenge your government has right now, is to get people to think differently and maybe look at what you're doing now and not maybe what you did back then? Not you personally, but what the government did back then?
There's multiple ways that I could answer that, but first of all, let me just say how fortunate both of you are. You're well-respected writers, and I think that is an incredibly admirable job, and one that I wish to go back to at some point, because as a writer, you get to reflect on things and you get to view things from a different point of view. So I don't know if I would be the best judge to say what people thought and what happened and where we are and how we got to where we are today, because I'm in the weeds. I'm moving forward, just trying to deliver solutions in any way that I possibly can. And certainly there will be a time in my life where I will do a deep reflection on my time in government and the contributions that I was fortunate enough to make. But in terms of looking at it from that macro perspective, certainly you have a much better perspective. Being in the media, you might have your finger on the pulse a little bit more than I do outside of my constituencies, whether it be the constituencies I serve as a Minister of Families and in my constituency of Riel. I have always, been mostly concerned with hearing from my folks that I live with and that I represent in my neighborhood, and of course the people in my ministry that I serve. And
I just want to say that quote there about that you guys are probably have your finger on the pulse, and I'm going to take that and put it on my Twitter profile now.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's kind of like the endorsements on the back of a book color. Yeah, well, I mean, I have to invite people in to say anything nice about me at all. So no, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. But no, I do think it's also, and I appreciate your kind words. We are freed of the burden of responsibility for decisions. Like, we may have ideas on what need to be done, but honestly, week to week, we barely even remember some of the ideas that we float. But with you guys, it's budgets, the public accounts, Auditor General, journalists. Everything you do and say is documented in. And I think you and we've talked privately, that I actually have tremendous respect for anybody who would seek elected office, because I think it's a horrible job. And so I really, I know the general public has a lot of destined ideas about who politicians are, what they do. But I know a lot of good people and smart people who are in politics, and some of them are lucky enough to govern. And it is where you get to see the true metal. We're in the cheap seats. Chucking bricks,
but I will say, by the way, I thought that was a great answer. And I think it's hard when you get hard questions like that. I think it's a real skill to be able to think, it is true. You are, I don't know if in the weeds is the right way. You're at the front lines of so many issues, and it's hard to see the forest for the trees, or the trees for the forest, or whatever that phrase is. But when you're so close to something, it is hard to sort of go, okay, what were the first 3 years like? What were the last 3 years like? Or something along that lines. But I think you did partly answer that a little bit by talking about the ways in which you're acting as minister now that might be a little bit different for a few years ago. One of the greatest refreshing things, and that I really feel empowered and excited about when I work in this industry. I never planned to be in media. I'm a writer, not a great one at that sometimes, and then I, when I worked in politics, I was an activist, really, right? So when you're an activist, you're coming up with solutions that sometimes are very ambitious and sometimes very big macro ideas versus getting into some of the more specific parts. But when we came on, we were discussing about systemic racism, and we talked a little bit about the situation involving Linda Beardy, which we are all lesser than, having lost this person in our community, which we all have are lesser than, and then of course the epidemic of violence with Indigenous women, and as a minister of women in the province, undoubtedly this is your portfolio and dealing with the epidemic of violence that. And we were talking, I don't have to argue systemic racism exists with you. And that is so refreshing. Because I think when people are from all different political walks of life, I think there are some people in our province and across the world who think that systemic racism isn't a real thing, that we all just have to pick up our bootstraps and work hard enough, and that somehow we'll all be able to achieve whatever we want. But there are systems in place that ensure that Linda Beardy didn't have the same opportunities as everybody else, and that particularly the situation that resulted in the end of her life was systemic. It came from a law and policy and practice, what everyday Canadians live and breathe, and that's not a condemnation. That's a call to action. Right? Yeah. What do you think your role is, or maybe this government's role is? We are heading into an election, so I think this will be somewhat of an issue, that during the election of the epidemic of violence with Indigenous women and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people, the family's calling for an independent inquiry outside of the police. And I think what they're asking for, and what I wrote about, was they're looking for history. They're talking about what was the flooding in Lake St. Martin First Nation, what was the impacts of child welfare. They're not just talking about what happened that day, although I think there's lots of questions still. Mm-hmm. What do you think the role of this government or the Ministry of Women is on the issue of murder, missing Indigenous women and girls, calls for justice, for example? What do you think is the next step? Well, how do we move forward as a community in this very dire time?
Yeah, certainly want to start by expressing deepest condolences to the family and the loved ones, and really echoing your statements, in that what happened to Linda was absolutely heartbreaking, and I really do respect the family's desire to find some answers and hope that there's some solace in those answers. What led to the circumstances of that day? What systems and processes created the circumstance that would put her where she was at the time of her death? And those are very appropriate questions that collectively, as a society and as a government, we do need to ask, and we need to find answers. And of course, we've touched on some of those things already in our conversation today, looking at child welfare reform. And one of the things that I believe is really, really important, and I have a piece of legislation before the House for consideration right now, that would mean if you are a parent and you're needing to, and you've got some challenges, and you've got the child welfare system involved in your family, and you may need respite, or you may need some support, to be able to receive those supports and receive that respite without a severing of your parental rights is really where we need to land. And historically, the system hasn't been like that. I've talked to many mums and dads who've been afraid to say, I need help in parenting. And who among us who are parents haven't needed to get some help? And yet there's people that live in fear of asking for that help, in their day-to-day lives, whether it be addressing the poverty that they're living in, or some mental health issues, or other impacts such as systemic racism that they haven't dealt with, and yet they can't. They feel like they can't move forward and ask for help because of fear of retribution, fear of losing their children. So that's something that we really need to take a look at. We also collectively, as a society and as a government, we need to do more to ensure that that we're ending gender-based violence. So 2 concrete actions that our government has taken in the last few months is we did sign on to the National Action Plan for Ending Gender-Based Violence. Minister Marcy Ian had proposed this action plan, and Manitoba was one of the first to sign on to that. We signed on with another agreement and got money for 24/7 crisis line at clinic to ensure that when you need help and you pick up the phone, there's somebody on the other end to help you. So those are a few things. And then just recently, formalizing our request once again of community, asking community to help us in government coordinate the efforts and the implementation of all the calls for justice in the MMIWG report. We know that government alone cannot do this work. We do have a whole of government approach to it, but that alone is not enough. And so really, really pleased to be working with Mama Wichita and under the leadership of matriarchal governing body with Sandra Delaron. They are going to be working at helping us implement some of those calls for justice. One of the calls for justice, or actually 5 calls for justice, were responded to in the setting up of that emergency response, the sexual assault emergency response. When we had introduced and passed Clare's Law, that responds specifically to 2 calls for justice. But there's a whole long list, as you're very well aware of calls for justice. And I'm really excited to be working with community once again to ensure that we become laser focused and move forward on implementation.
I was only kidding about going 3 hours. I mean, we could.
We'd like to. I mean,
yeah,
I've learned a lot.
That's okay. Adam, order dinner in. We're staying for the long haul. Rochelle, we really appreciate you coming in. I won't pretend that, even as charming as we are, the whole idea of this kind of an interview is probably, working more without a net than a scrum or a sit-down interview. So I appreciate the fact that you've done it. Please tell the Premier how much fun you had, because we're trying to get her to come on. And I think it's really important that we get different perspectives. And Nagan and I were both super excited when you said you'd do this, because you've got a lot to say, and and this is your forum to come and say it.
I also say, I add to that, one thing I've always really deeply admired about you is that never been afraid to listen, and whether we've been at a dinner or whether I think my father said that you had a visit one time, and that that I think the art of listening is something that oftentimes is not encouraged or rewarded in government. And so I secretly think this is because, when you get women in charge, women listen so much more better. That I don't need to be stereotypical, but I think that, I think when you get women, oftentimes women are thinking broad picture. They're also thinking about families, and it's not that men don't do that. I just think that oftentimes women in leadership, particularly in the Indigenous community, the most successful initiatives and organizations in the city are really Indigenous female run, and I think that that's important. And so, but I also think that I see many of those features in you, and I just want to say I really appreciate that you came on the podcast and spent some time with us. And even though we didn't get too many jokes in today, we talked about a lot of serious stuff.
No, we talked a lot of serious stuff, but I think we have a part 2 with Rochelle, because we promised that she would get to ask questions, and we haven't been able to do that yet.
Right. We'll turn the tables for next time, and I'll dust off my old journalistic handbook, and I'll ask you guys some questions.
I'm scared for the answers myself.
No, but it's also like, if this goes, because we've been very fortunate. We've had a lot of really strong and interesting women on the podcast, even some of co-hosted, and it's not unusual to get feedback from people saying, yeah, you know, you guys are okay, but like you could give the podcast to like Rochelle and Jen Zarati and then
Julia Simone,
and they wouldn't even miss us. So
but Big Miigwech, thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you both for having me on and talking about some of these really important topics. And it's just really been a pleasure. And I think that my parting words of wisdom is I think everybody who has worked as a politician should start off as a journalist, because that's where we really learn to listen. And those skills that I honed as a journalist, especially running up, Dan always got the good stories, and I was always trailing behind with
you were hanging out in our office in the ledge because
trying to steal his scoop, you know. But you learn to listen and sometimes even eavesdrop, and those are really critical skills as in life, in anything that a person may do. But many of the best lessons I learned were back in Crecom, where my journalism instructor said, if you can string a sentence together, you will never be out of work. And so far, fingers crossed, those words have been very true in my life.
Indeed. Thank you very much for being here.
Miigwech, thanks.